The envelope was already on the table when Marina walked into the room. That was how she knew. Not the carefully neutral expressions of the two people sitting behind the desk. Not the box of tissues that someone had placed at the corner in a gesture of soft preparation. Not even the temperature of the room, which was slightly cooler than usual in the way of spaces where important and unpleasant decisions are delivered. It was the envelope, sealed, her name written on the front in the company font, the same one used for lease agreements and formal notices and correspondence that permanently changed things. Marina had read enough documents in her career to understand what a sealed envelope on a conference table meant before anyone opened their mouth. She sat down. She placed her bag on the floor beside her chair. She folded her hands in her lap. She did not reach for the envelope. The woman from Human Resources was named Carol. She had worked at Costello Group for 9 years and wore the same small pearl earrings every single day without exception. And she sat with her hands folded on the table and began to speak in the measured tone of someone who had prepared the words in advance so that they would come out evenly. She used language like strategic realignment and workforce restructuring and transition support, and Marina heard every word and understood none of them in the way they were intended to be understood. What she understood was the silence beneath the language. The company had decided to reduce its workforce. 7 positions were being eliminated. Marina's was one of them. 14 years. 14 years of arriving early and staying late and reading the files that other people found too dense or too long or too full of detail to bother with. 14 years of catching errors in contracts before those errors became expensive problems, of flagging compliance failures before they became penalty notices, of reviewing documents that no one else wanted to look at closely because they were complicated, and careful attention to complicated things was, in most organizations, an undervalued quality that eventually became an invisible one. She had saved the company from disputes it never even knew were coming. She had been, for 14 years, the kind of reliable infrastructure that people notice only when it stops working. And now there was a sealed envelope and Carol's pearl earrings and the box of tissues nobody had touched, and a man beside Carol whose name Marina did not know, and whose function in this meeting appeared to be witnessing, with his pen held ready over a blank page, and his expression carefully emptied of anything that could be read as a reaction. Marina picked up the envelope. She did not open it. She asked one question. She asked who would be handling the 2 files that were approaching their deadlines in the next 10 days, and specifically, the zoning compliance review attached to the Ferrani property, which was at a stage that required precise understanding of the relevant municipal code, and that would deteriorate fast if the person taking it over did not know exactly what they were looking at. Carol looked at the man beside her. The man said those matters would be handled internally. Marina looked at him for a moment and then said, "Of course, and thank you." She stood. She shook both of their hands because she was that kind of person, the kind who did things correctly even in circumstances that did not deserve her correctness. She walked down the corridor and through the glass doors into the open plan area on the 3rd floor, where she had worked for the last 9 of her 14 years at the company. Her desk was ordinary around her. The monitor, the keyboard, the small stack of current files she had been working through that morning before the meeting, the pen she had left on top of the uppermost folder, the ceramic dish beside the monitor that held paper clips, a pale green dish she had found at a small market 6 years ago because she liked the color of it, the particular way it caught the light from the window at a certain angle in the afternoon. She opened the bottom drawer and took out her bag. She took her coat from the back of the chair. She took the ceramic dish. She left the paper clips on the desk in a small heap. She looked at them for one moment. Then she picked up her bag and the dish and walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor and stood with her back straight and her face held in the expression of a person who has decided what shape they are going to hold until they are somewhere private enough to let it go. No one spoke to her in the elevator or the lobby. She walked through the revolving door into the street, and the street was going about its Tuesday afternoon business without any awareness of what had just happened in the conference room on the 2nd floor. A delivery truck blocked the near lane. 2 men sat outside the corner cafe talking with the animation of people who are discussing something they find genuinely interesting. A woman walked past with a child, who was insisting on carrying something too heavy for him and refusing assistance. Marina walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. She looked at the steering wheel. She remained like that for perhaps 4 minutes. Then she started the car and drove home. The drive took 22 minutes. She made pasta when she arrived because it was what she did when she needed something to do with her hands, and pasta required exactly the right amount of attention to keep the surface of her mind occupied, while the deeper part processed what it needed to process. She boiled the water. She salted it the right amount, the amount that made it taste like the sea. She cooked the pasta for exactly the time the packet specified, and not 1 minute longer. She made a simple sauce with tomatoes and garlic and fresh basil she had on the windowsill. She ate at the kitchen table with a glass of water, and the sealed envelope lying beside the glass where she had set it when she emptied her bag. She washed the pot and the pan and the plate and put everything away. She made coffee. She sat back down at the kitchen table, and after a while she opened the envelope and read the severance agreement inside it from the first line to the last, including the footnotes, including the attached schedules, including the clause on the second page that most people in her situation would have missed, because it was written in the subordinate language of a provision that appeared to be standard, but that, on close reading, was slightly broader in what it asked her to relinquish than was strictly necessary. She noted it. She did not have the energy to do anything about it tonight. The severance amount itself was more generous than she had anticipated, which told her something specific. A generous severance in these situations is a legal product, not a human one. It means lawyers were consulted before the conversation in the conference room happened. It means the figure was calculated with reference to the company's liability exposure and the cost of making the departure clean and uncontested. It means that while Marina had been at her desk reading other people's files and solving problems they did not yet know they had, someone in an office with a better view had been building a case for removing her and asking lawyers how much it would cost to do it tidily. She read this in the number as clearly as she read anything else, and she put the papers on the table beside the cold coffee and sat with the information for a moment. Then she went to bed, because there was nothing more useful to do with the end of a Tuesday that had ended this way. She did not cry, not that evening and not in the days that followed. This was not numbness. It was the specific quality of Marina's interior life, which did not perform and did not express itself before it had determined what to do next. The decision came first. The emotion, once it had been privately processed, arranged itself around the decision. The weeks that followed were strange in their openness. Marina had not had unscheduled mornings since she was in her 20s. She woke at her usual time and dressed in the way she always dressed and made her coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the street below, and then the morning opened in front of her with nothing required of it, no urgent files, no expected calls, no colleague waiting on her reading of a document before a meeting. The shape of her days had always been built from other people's requirements, and now the requirements were gone and the shape with them. And the absence was conspicuous in the way that the absence of a sound you have stopped consciously hearing can be conspicuous when it finally stops. She did not immediately look for another job. This surprised her, because she was not given to prolonged reflection as a rule. She was practical and forward-moving, and she had always solved problems by engaging with them rather than sitting with them. But she found that she needed, for the first time in a long time, to think carefully about what she was actually moving toward. 14 years of building expertise that had served an institution rather than herself. She needed to sit with that fact long enough to understand it before she decided what came next. She started running again, a habit she had lost to a knee injury 4 years ago and never fully recovered. She started carefully, 30 minutes in the early mornings along the waterfront, building back to 40 and then 50. The rhythm of it created a useful mental blankness, not empty but productive, in which things arranged themselves without being forced. She called her sister Donna in Milan twice that week. Donna was practical and warm in the way of someone who had navigated several difficult transitions herself and had found each one, in retrospect, manageable. She said something good would come. Marina said she knew. This was true. She knew with the same quiet confidence she brought to complex documents that she would figure out what came next. What she was working out was what she wanted it to be. She read property listings in the evenings. This had been a habit since her mid-20s, when she had started working in property law and developed what she could only describe as a professional fascination with the hidden life of buildings. Every property had a history embedded in its documents, a chain of ownership going back through decades, disputes and settlements and small adjustments made by people long dead for reasons that could sometimes still be inferred from the paperwork. She found this deeply interesting in the way some people find complex novels interesting, as a genuine engagement with human narrative rather than simply as entertainment. It was on a Thursday night, 11 days after the conference room, at 11 minutes past midnight, that she found the pensione in Pozzuoli. The listing was on a regional auction site that Marina checked occasionally when she was reading at night, a site that handled properties released through municipal processes or legal resolutions or administrative proceedings. The pensione appeared as a standard entry, 3 stories, early 20th century, 12 rooms, a courtyard, located on a narrow street in a part of Pozzuoli she knew slightly from having driven through it some years ago, 2 blocks from the water. The photograph showed a building that had been vacant for some years, the facade needing attention, the windows shuttered, the courtyard visible in one exterior shot as an overgrown space that had been something considered before it was abandoned. Then she looked at the price. She stopped scrolling. She looked at the number. She looked at it again. The figure was so far below what a building of this size and location should have been worth on any reasonable measure that her first instinct was a data entry error. She had seen those on auction sites before, a decimal point misplaced, a digit omitted. She opened the full listing and began reading from the beginning. She opened every attached document. Most people looking at a listing on a site like this would not open the attached documents. Marina opened all of them as a matter of habit developed over 14 years of professional reading. She found the reason on page 3 of the auction conditions document. The building had a legal status complicated by an old commercial dispute. The dispute had been partially resolved through court proceedings some years earlier, but one element had not been fully settled, a question concerning the calculation of administrative costs related to the original commercial transaction. The buyer in this auction would be required to assume responsibility for resolving this remaining element. The document was specific about the nature of the resolution process and included a defined upper estimate of the associated costs. Marina read this 3 times. She performed a calculation on her phone. The auction price plus the upper estimate of the resolution costs produced a total that was still, by a meaningful margin, below what the building should have been worth in a straightforward transaction. The price was low not because of a data error but because of paperwork, complex, specific, intimidating paperwork that the majority of potential buyers would either never locate or, having located, would find too daunting to navigate. Paperwork that was, for Marina, a Tuesday afternoon. She sat at her kitchen table reading at midnight. She pulled the ownership history from the public land registry. She found the original commercial dispute in the public court records and read the partial resolution and understood the remaining element completely by 12:40 in the morning. She understood what it required. She understood what it would cost. She understood that it was manageable. She placed a bid at 12 minutes past midnight. She received a confirmation on screen and sat with it for perhaps a minute. Then she made tea and stood at the kitchen window, looking at the street below, and thought about the building in Pozzuoli, and the courtyard that had been something careful before it became overgrown, and the high ceilings visible in the interior photographs, and the way old buildings held the evidence of their full history in their structure, if you knew how to look for it. The auction closed on a Thursday afternoon. Marina's bid was the winning one. The confirmation came at 3:47 in the afternoon. She called her bank. She called a contact at the land registry about the transfer timeline. She made pasta and ate it at the kitchen table with the confirmation printout beside her plate and felt, for the first time since November, the particular alignment of moving in the right direction. What she did not know, and had no way of knowing, was that for the past 18 months certain people in the neighborhood around Pozzuoli had operated under a clear and unwritten understanding about what would happen with that property when it became available. She did not know that the auction result had produced a phone call within the hour of being posted. She did not know that the name on the winning bid had created a problem for someone who had expected there to be no problem. She drove to Pozzuoli on a Saturday morning with a clipboard and a camera and good shoes, because she was a thorough person, and photographs were useful, but they were not enough. She needed to stand in the building. She needed to see what she had bought. The building was as the photographs had shown it. Stone facade, worn by coastal weather over a century, but intact. Heavy front door with oxidized ironwork. All windows present and shuttered and whole. Marina stood on the pavement and looked at it with the patient attention she brought to new documents, reading before responding, before deciding anything. Then she pushed open the courtyard gate and went in. The courtyard was larger than the photographs had suggested. Vegetation had taken almost everything, but beneath it, she could see the paving stones, good stone, well laid, with the settled density of construction that had been done correctly and had had decades to prove it. The walls were high and sound. In the far corner stood an old well, its stone surround intact, decorative now, quietly present. Marina walked the perimeter with her clipboard, taking notes and photographs, measuring the eastern wall against the boundary documentation she had committed to memory from the 1981 settlement. She was photographing the south corner when the gate opened behind her. The man who came through it was in his mid-50s, dressed simply, with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who have not needed to signal anything for a very long time, because they are accustomed to being understood clearly, regardless. He said good morning in the tone of someone for whom the pleasantry was entirely natural rather than performed. He gave his name as Matteo. He said he had heard there had been a result in the recent auction, and was glad to have the chance to speak with whoever had been successful. Marina said good morning. She waited. Matteo said he represented certain interests in the neighborhood, people with a long connection to this area and this property in particular. He said there were sometimes arrangements around buildings like this one that did not appear in public documents, but were nonetheless real and understood by all the relevant parties. He said he hoped Marina appreciated the situation. Marina asked him to be specific about the arrangement he was describing and whose interests he was representing. Matteo smiled slightly. He said the specifics were not really the important part. The important part was that the people who had an interest in this property were serious people with a long-standing and significant presence in the community, and that it would be much better for everyone involved if Marina were to consider withdrawing her purchase and allowing things to proceed as they had been expected to proceed. He let the word everyone expand past its ordinary meaning into something that contained additional weight. Marina said she had completed a legal purchase through a registered public auction. She said her documentation was in order. She said she would be happy to receive written communication from any party that believed they had a legal interest in the property, provided the communication included the full names of the parties involved, so the matter could be properly assessed. Matteo looked at her for a moment. He said he hoped she would think carefully about her situation, and that they would speak again. Then he left the courtyard. The gate closed behind him without unusual force. Marina stood in the overgrown space after he was gone. She pressed her hand against the courtyard wall and felt the stone beneath her palm, solid and warm from the morning sun. She stood like that for a moment. Then she took out her phone and opened her notes and wrote down the time and Matteo's name and everything that had been said, in order and in full. She finished her assessment of the courtyard, made her notes, and drove home. She gave the situation 3 days. During those 3 days, she continued working on the assessment and the repair plan, ran in the mornings, visited Mr. Ferrante with pastries, and listened to a story about a card game in Genoa, cooked in the evenings. She thought about the situation steadily and without anxiety. In the directed way she thought through complex documents, working toward the solution rather than around the problem. By the 4th day, she knew what she was going to do. On the 5th morning, she drove back to the pensione to continue the interior assessment, and the visitors came to her while she was working on the ground floor. There were 3 of them. The man who spoke introduced himself as Luca. He was around 40, well-dressed with deliberate simplicity, and he had the self-possession of someone accustomed to setting the terms of conversations. He said he understood Marina had acquired this property through the auction, and was there because there had been a misunderstanding. He said the misunderstanding was not her fault. He said the property had been intended for a particular purpose by people with a long-standing presence in the community, and the auction had proceeded in a way that did not account for this intention. He said the most straightforward resolution would be for Marina to withdraw from the purchase. He mentioned compensation. Marina said she had completed a legal purchase through a registered public auction. She said her documentation was in order. She said she welcomed written communication from any party with a legal interest in the property, full names included. Luca looked at her. He said the legal element was addressable. He said the important thing was that she understand that the people involved were serious people, and that resolving things cooperatively would be very much better for everyone. The word everyone carried the same extended weight as before. Marina repeated what she had said, pleasantly, without decoration. Luca said he hoped she would think carefully about her situation. He said they would be in touch. He left with the 2 men behind him, and the front door closed. Marina set her clipboard on the windowsill. She pressed her palm against the interior wall and felt the stone behind the plaster, solid and old. She stood like that for a moment. Then she took out her phone and called Enzo Cattaneo. He answered on the 2nd ring. Marina had met Enzo 8 years earlier through a complicated boundary dispute file that had arrived on her desk in poor condition, his daughter-in-law's property. 2 previous lawyers had mishandled it. Marina had spent 3 months reading every document in the file, including surveys from the 1960s that no one had referenced in the recent correspondence because no one had thought to look for them. She had found a measurement in a footnote on page 11 of a 1967 survey that resolved the dispute cleanly. She commissioned a confirming survey, filed the resolution, and closed the case. Enzo had called her personally to thank her, something that had never happened to Marina before in her professional life, and he had told her that if she ever needed anything she should call. She had thanked him and not called for 8 years because nothing had required it until now. She explained the situation precisely. The auction, the documentation, Matteo in the courtyard, Luca in the corridor, the particular use of the word everyone on both occasions, the street name. She told him everything in the order it had happened. Enzo listened through all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for several seconds. Then he asked for the street name again. She repeated it. He made a sound that was not a word but that contained something. He said he would make some calls. Marina thanked him. She did not ask what the calls would involve. She understood that asking would be the wrong question. She ended the call. She picked up her clipboard. She finished the ground floor assessment, measuring and photographing every room, noting every problem. In the storeroom off the main corridor she found, behind a panel that had been added in the 1970s, a stack of 7 guest books in blue cardboard covers, faded at the edges, spanning the years 1961 to 2018. She sat on the floor of the storeroom and read several entries from the most recent one, Italian and French and German, and 1 entry in English from a couple who gave their hometown as Birmingham and who wrote 3 sentences about the quality of the light from their window and the quietness of the street at night. Marina read the English entry twice. She put the books back carefully and noted their location. She drove home. She made dinner. She went to bed and slept without difficulty. 4 days later, a man knocked on the open front door of the pensione. He was in his mid-40s, slightly overweight, wearing a jacket that was slightly too large across the shoulders, and he had the expression of someone who was relieved to be doing a task, rather than still anticipating it. He said his name was Gino and he was there on behalf of certain interests in the neighborhood, and had something to deliver. He held out an envelope that was not sealed. Marina took it, and read the single page inside, plain language. The arrangement previously understood to exist regarding the property at this address was dissolved. No further communication regarding the matter would be forthcoming. Not signed by anyone Marina recognized, which was consistent with how she understood these things worked. She read it twice. She folded it precisely and put it in her bag. She thanked Gino. He gave a small nod of someone very glad to be done with something and walked away down the street at a pace that suggested he did not wish to linger. Marina stood in the doorway of her building. The street was ordinary around her. She turned and went back inside and continued her work. The restoration took 6 months. She had planned for 8 and came in ahead partly through good organization and partly through being present every day, making decisions with precision and speed, which kept the work moving at the pace it needed to move. The plastering team, a father and son who worked with the efficiency of people who had been doing the same skilled thing together for a long time, addressed the eastern wall of the ground floor first. The father, Berto, identified a drainage issue behind the plaster that was causing the damage, and would cause it again if only the surface were treated. Marina said to fix the drainage. He did. He charged exactly what he had quoted and finished 2 days before the schedule he had given. Gianluca came in the 3rd week, recommended by a timber supplier as the person to talk to about the staircase handrail. He walked through the building in the unhurried way of someone reading a complicated document, making sounds that communicated his assessments before he put them into words. About the staircase structure he was reassuring. The handrail needed replacement, but the structure was sound. He showed Marina in his small notebook of careful drawings how he could replicate the profile of the original handrail in new timber so precisely that the replacement would be indistinguishable. She said yes. He made the handrail. It looked as though it had been there since 1923, because that was what he had set out to make. The rooms were addressed floor by floor, top to bottom. 4 windows resealed, which changed those rooms immediately, making them contained and solid in a way they had not been. Several floors original tile, in excellent condition, needing only cleaning. In 2 rooms the original tile had been covered with linoleum in the 1980s, and when Marina carefully removed it, the tile underneath was intact, the pattern clear, the colors still present after 40 years hidden under something that had no business being there. She kept those floors. She told everyone not to touch them except to clean. She chose white walls because the ceiling heights could carry them. She sourced furniture from markets and reclamation yards, solid pieces that did not match each other except in quality, pieces that looked accumulated rather than purchased. She was careful about nothing looking too deliberate. She wanted the building to look like what it was. She called Claire Barrett in the 5th month. 6 years alongside each other at Castello Group, Claire managing commercial leasing with the kind of operational intelligence that held complete structures in her head, without writing them down. Marina explained what she was building and what she was offering. Claire said yes before the explanation was finished. 2 weeks later, she called Francis Adler, 5 years at Castello Group in property compliance, the most thorough reader of municipal regulation Marina had encountered in her professional life. Francis said she needed to think overnight and called back at 8:30 the next morning and said yes. The three of them worked through the final 2 months together. Claire built the entire operational framework from the small room off the courtyard, bookings and suppliers and pricing and the guest communication structure, working with the intensity of someone doing something for the first time that genuinely belonged to her. Francis moved through the municipal process for permits and licenses with the efficiency of years of practice, finding 2 procedural routes that shortened 2 timelines considerably, routes she found herself because she read the complete regulation rather than the summary. Marina continued the physical work, making the 100 small decisions that arrive at the end of a restoration, the weight of the towels, the height of the new front desk, the material for the signage, the color of a door. The sign for the front door was iron, small, mounted at eye level. The name on it was the building's original name, the one from the 1961 guest book, the one it had carried for 60 years before closure. Marina gave it back. They opened in the last week of March. The first booking had come 2 weeks earlier, from a family in Lyon who had found a mention of the pensione on a travel forum and written to ask if rooms were available in June. Marina replied the same afternoon. They booked rooms 4 and 6 for 4 nights. By the time the doors opened, 10 of the 12 rooms were full through summer. By the end of April, both remaining rooms were taken and there was a waiting list. Marina walked through the building on the first morning of operation, floor by floor, room by room, the way she had always read complex documents, from the beginning, not skipping sections. The white walls and the wooden floors and the clean light through the properly sealed windows, Gianluca's handrail, indistinguishable from what had always been there, the tile floors she had found under the linoleum, still themselves, still whole, the ceramic numbers on each door that Francis had sourced in exactly the right proportion. At the end of the second-floor corridor, the window that looked down into the courtyard, the wooden benches and the lavender and the old well, and the paving stones that lay perfectly flat because the sections that had shifted had been correctly reset. She stood at that window for a long time. She thought about Matteo in the courtyard and Luca in the corridor, and the envelope Gino had brought on the 4th morning. She thought about Enzo Cattaneo answering on the 2nd ring. She thought about Carol's pearl earrings in the fluorescent light of a Tuesday in November, and the sealed envelope with her name on it in the company font, and the paper clips she had left in a heap on the desk and walked away from. She thought about 14 years of reading documents that other people found too long or too complicated, or too full of fine print to be worth the sustained attention. 14 years of finding the problem in the clause on page 7, the resolution in the footnote on page 11. 14 years of building something, though she had not been building it for herself. The skill, the method, the close attention. She had been building it the whole time and it had gone with her when she left. She went downstairs to help Claire open the breakfast service. A journalist named Lucy found them in late May. She was writing about small independent guest houses in the Campania region and contacted the pensione through the website. Marina said yes, and they sat in the courtyard on a warm afternoon and talked for almost an hour. Lucy had her recorder and her notebook and the genuine interest of someone who was actually listening rather than waiting to write down a headline. Marina talked about reading the attached conditions document on a regional auction site at midnight. She talked about Berto and the drainage behind the eastern wall and Gianluca and the handrail made to match the original. She talked about Claire and Francis and what it felt like to build something alongside people who genuinely owned it. She did not talk about Matteo or Luca or Gino or the phone call to a man who answered on the 2nd ring. These were not secrets. They were simply not relevant to what the building was now, and Marina did not include information that was not relevant. Near the end of the interview, Lucy asked whether Marina had anything she would say to women who had worked long careers, built expertise over many years, and then found one day that the institution they had served had decided they were no longer necessary. Marina was quiet for a moment. She looked at the courtyard around her, the lavender along the south wall, and the two guests finishing their breakfast at the far table, and the old well in the corner, catching the afternoon light in the particular way she had come to find reliable and pleasant. She said she did not think she had anything to say to those women. She said they already knew. Lucy pressed her gently. She said the perspective would be valuable to readers. Marina refilled her coffee. She thought about the question with the same care she gave to everything she believed deserved care. She said she thought most people read only the surface of things, the headline and the price and the section that was meant to be read. She said the information that actually mattered was almost always in the part that most people did not bother with. The attached document, the conditions on page 3, the footnote on page 11, the clause on page 7 that seemed like a technicality until it turned out to be the whole point. She said some buildings just need someone to read the paperwork closely enough. Lucy wrote it down and sat with it for a moment, and then said it was a beautiful way to put it. Marina said thank you, and they sat in the courtyard in the pleasant way of a conversation that has found its natural endpoint and is simply finishing in the warmth of what was said. The interview was published 3 weeks later. It was accurate and well written and brought a noticeable increase in inquiries for the following season. But the part that traveled was the last line, about the paperwork, about reading it closely enough. It appeared in messages and shared posts with no additional context because no additional context was necessary. The people who shared it most were women who had worked long years in jobs that had one day decided they were no longer needed, women who had read the documents and caught the errors, and protected the institutions that eventually handed them a sealed envelope and called it a realignment. They shared the line because they understood it, not as a metaphor, as a plain statement of what the knowledge does when you carry it out of the building where it was built. It goes with you. It waits. One night at midnight it sees something on a regional auction site, and it knows exactly what it is looking at, and it places a bid. The guest house ran at full capacity through the first season. The family from Lyon stayed in rooms 4 and 6 in June, and left an entry in the guest book in the common room off the courtyard. They wrote in French that the courtyard was the most peaceful place they had ever eaten breakfast. Marina read it, and then read several entries from the 1970s and 1980s, people from France and Germany and England, writing in their different languages about the quietness of the street, and the quality of the morning light, and the kindness of the people who ran the building in those years. The regional director's nephew at Costello Group had lasted 11 months before being transferred. The Ferrani zoning review had been mishandled, and the company had paid a municipal penalty. Marina thought about neither of these things with any particular feeling. They were facts. She had a building. She had 2 colleagues who were doing, for the first time, work that was genuinely theirs. She had 12 rooms booked through the following April, and a waiting list for the summer after that. She had the guest books from 1961 in their stack on the shelf in the common room, and the iron sign beside the front door, with the building's oldest name on it, and the lavender along the south wall that would come back in the spring, and Gianluca's handrail that looked as though it had always been there. She had, in the filing cabinet in her study, a single-page letter saying an arrangement was dissolved and no further contact would be made. She had, somewhere in an office building in the city, a heap of paper clips on a desk that had not been hers for several months. She thought about the paper clips occasionally, not with any emotion she could fully name, simply with the clarity that certain small details hold in the memory, persistent and specific. She thought about them now, for a moment, on an October evening in the courtyard, when the guests had gone to dinner, and the light was going orange above the roofline, and the lavender had finished blooming for the season but would return. Then she went inside to help Claire close up for the evening, because there was work to do, and she was that kind of person, and the evening was not yet finished.